Welcome to Bled Talk, the podcast where insightful conversations meet language learning. I'm your host, Samuel Bledsoe, and on this show, we dive deep into a variety of topics with fascinating guests from all walks of life. Whether you're an English learner looking to sharpen your language skills, or simply someone who enjoys thought-provoking discussions, Bled Talk is something for you. From engaging interviews to solo episodes filled with knowledge and inspiration, join us as we explore the world one conversation at a time. Get ready for a journey of learning, curiosity, and meaningful dialogues. Welcome to Bled Talk. Welcome everybody this week to Bled Talk. We are here with Kian, and he is a teacher. He's a content creator on Instagram. He speaks so many languages, and he has a really interesting story. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to have you on, Kian, here is because I love your content. I love what you post. I love what you say. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. And, if you want to go ahead and just kind of give us your story, tell us how it all started.
I appreciate that, Sam. I appreciate it. It's an honor. I am a Californian 26-year-old man, and I moved to Brazil about a year ago in February of 2023. I moved there because my girlfriend is Brazilian. I met her in the United States, which I feel like is not as common for most people. But I met her there in 2019. I started learning Portuguese around when the pandemic started and things got complicated. So I never visited Brazil for like 2 years, but I kept learning Portuguese because, like you said, I speak some other languages. I already spoke like 4 or 5 languages when I started learning Portuguese. So I thought, I'm pretty familiar with Spanish. This shouldn't be too hard. And to be honest, it was actually quite fun, right? It was really fun. I don't know if you had the same experience learning Portuguese, but it's really fun to make Brazilian friends, even on the internet, even if you're not in the country. So I just kind of ran with it, fell in love with the culture, started making videos just to emulate the sense of being in a classroom. Because when I was in Japanese class in high school, every week we would have some sort of presentation, like a PowerPoint, or we had to make a video, or we had to do a conversational practice. And I always felt like, without doing those sort of really practical assignments, without somebody telling you to do that, it kind of really limits what you can do and how you feel comfortable and the amount of time you actually work in the language. So I started making a bunch of scripts in Portuguese. I would send them to my friends on Hello Talk who I would meet. They would help me edit it, and then I would record the audio, send it to them. They would say, oh, you pronounced this a little wrong. And then when it was finally kind of acceptable for my level, where I was like, okay, this sounds good to me, for where I'm at, this is good Portuguese. I would post it on the internet, and I would see comments coming down saying like, oh, you did so great, but you should say this way, and you should say this way. So I kind of turned my platform into a studygram, so to speak. I was crowdsourcing the Portuguese out of my viewers. So that just kept going. And this year, in 2023, I kind of blew up in Brazil once I moved here. I went from 3,000 followers to 75,000 now currently, which was a huge increase for me over the course of a year. And I kind of found my voice. So now cool people like you are asking me to come onto the podcast. And it's just a pleasure to be in this position.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really cool. And so you said like the people kind of were starting to correct you. Do you feel like here in Brazil, this is an interesting question I always ask, because we always hear that that thing of like, okay, so if a Brazilian learns English really well and goes to the States and tries to talk to an American, if they hear a little bit of an accent, they start, the American starts freaking out and they don't understand.
Right.
But here it's different. You try and learn, you speak terribly, but they still tell you that it's great. Do you think that they did a good job at helping correct you? Like, do you think that their way of correcting you was kind of what you needed?
Yeah, I definitely think in the beginning, because I'll say it this way, like when you do things the way I did it, like I didn't have a teacher. I was completely using books and people. I was trying to extract the language out of the tongues of the people that I was speaking to. So I would ask someone a question. When you ask a grammatical question or a gíria, right? Maybe to someone a gíria can mean one thing, but if they're in a different region, that same word has a different connotation, or maybe they would choose a different grammatical structure. And so the thing that I realize is that it's really important when you go for those corrections from native speakers is to get like 10 opinions on any given topic. You can't just ask one Brazilian, oh, how do you say it this way? And then they correct you. And then maybe you're like, okay, this is the right way. You have to ask like 10 of them. And then you kind of average out their responses and you say, okay, maybe some people might say it like this. Some people might say it like this. But at least for me, most people say it this way. So I'm going to say it this way because it's the most common way, right?
Right.
So that's an example.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, because it's kind of like whenever we talk about things that we say in the States, I think I was talking to another guy earlier, and we were talking about how, Brazil is it's such a big country, like compared to most other countries in the world, and the US is also, just a huge country. And so a lot of times we kind of forget to talk about like regional things, for example, if you're in São Paulo, that is, there's a lot of different words in São Paulo that they don't use here in Curitiba. And
Totally.
in the Northeast or in the North. And it's just like, for example, there's things that you probably say all the time in California, and out in the Midwest where I'm from, we don't say that, or vice versa.
Definitely.
I did a podcast with a teacher who was from California the other day, and she was telling me about some things that she says to her friends, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. I have the idea, but I'm like, it's not something, that I do all the time. And I think that that's important for people to notice, because you can't just say, okay, this is American English, and like learn a couple things and say, okay, yeah, this is going to work great, or this is British English, or whatever it may be, because for some people it's one thing, and for some
Right.
it's another. Like I watched a video one time, and there was a teacher who she said that the word rubber in British English was like an eraser, and she said in American English a rubber is an eraser, and
Yeah.
in British
I saw
English
this
it's another
video.
one.
Yeah.
And I sent her a message afterwards, and I was like, I hope you know that it's the opposite, because
Yeah.
I said just
That video, I saw it too, and it made me doubt myself. I was like, I've always known a rubber to be a camisinha, right?
Right.
Like, to me, that's rubber. But, if you called an eraser a rubber, in the context, I would understand, but it would sound really British to me. So I saw that video.
Well,
like,
and I sent a message to a couple of my British English teacher friends, and I had asked them, I said, what is a rubber to you? And they were like, oh, it's an eraser. And I was like, okay, so I'm not crazy. Like I thought maybe I was like, oh, am I just in like this bubble that believes this? But then I also remembered, because I am an avid rap fan. I love rap a lot. I know I don't seem like a person who does, but I love it. And a lot of rap songs, and then they talk about rubbers. I guarantee
rubber. Yeah, exactly.
not talking about erasers. And so, there's like little things like that. And here, here in Brazil, it's the same thing. There's little words that you have for different things, and it feels like they have a million different names for the same thing. But it's a lot of fun. And when you came to Brazil for the first time, was your intention to come and stay, or just to kind of visit and see how you felt?
Well, so I initially planned to come in Brazil in December of 2019 to visit Julia, who's my current girlfriend. At the time, we had just met each other for like a week in San Francisco. She was traveling, and then she went back to Brazil. We kept talking, and she was like, oh, you should come to my festa de formatura, my graduation party. And I was like, that sounds fun. And as it was coming up, I got this big business opportunity to go meet with Sony Music, which is a completely other story that I won't get too much into. But I basically had this opportunity to pitch an idea to these really high up executives. And so I said, okay, I got to go do that. And I can go to Brazil maybe in February, and we'll enjoy Carnival together. And then COVID. And so after COVID, I was like, damn, I'm not going to Brazil. But because I was stuck in my house all day, it gave me a lot of time to learn Portuguese. So when I finally planned my first trip to Brazil, coincidentally, I had already been in other relationships, and Juliet was already in another relationship here in Brazil. So we kind of lost contact the week before I planned to come, I was just going to go on like a big month-long trip to the 4 different cities from São Paulo to Varginha, Belo Horizonte, Salvador, and Natal. So 5 cities. So it was a huge trip. I went all throughout the country. I took the ônibus. I saw a lot of Brazil, and it was really awesome. And a week before, she called me, and she's like, "Eu sou solteira." And I was like, no way. I happen to learn the Portuguese language, and I'm going to Brazil. She didn't know I learned Portuguese. So it was a huge surprise for her. I showed up to her festa de formatura. I was talking with her family and friends. Like it was like a movie moment, like it was meant to be. So
Right.
I didn't have intentions of staying. Then I saw her and we kind of fell in love again. And then I was like, shit, now I got to come back to Brazil again this year. Right. And so because we started talking again and I couldn't do the long distance. And so since I'm already a remote employee, I said, okay, I'm going to go spend a month in Brazil with you. So we spent a month in Jundiaí, which is the city where she's from, in the not too interior. They call it interior, but the CPTM, it connects to Jundiaí.
Yeah, it's basically like it's like suburban São Paulo. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's the last thing that I would consider São Paulo before Campinas. After that, Campinas is interior.
Right.
You can take that. So basically, I just stayed, and then I spent time with her, and then she came to San Diego for a couple months towards the end of 2022. And she spent Christmas there with my family, and we were trying to see like, oh, should you move to the US or should I move to Brazil? And just based on my profession, the fact that I'm a completely remote worker, and her profession, the fact that she's a dentist, she would have to go back to school to practice dentistry in the US. She would not be able to even be an assistant with her foreign degree, which doctors only need a residency, but dentists need to go back to their entire school because it's just a whole thing. So I basically said to her, like towards the end of her stay, I was like, look, it's looking to me like I'm probably going to move to Brazil because, like it just makes sense. I want you to be able to continue your career. I want to be able to, spend time with you. And also I love Brazilian culture. I love Portuguese. So for me, it didn't seem like a huge downside. It was like, this seems like a nice, fun adventure. Like, let's try it out. And worst comes to worst, I'll just go back home.
Yeah.
Just back home.
And that's funny because sometimes people are like, well, what are you going to do if it doesn't work? And it's like, the plane still works. So,
I will go home. Yeah.
Just going to
go stop in Colombia on the way there. Like, yeah. I don't know.
Exactly.
There's a whole world.
And you talked a little bit about loving like Brazilian culture. Was it like that from the beginning? Did you get here and just be like, oh, this is great? Did you have a little bit of culture shock, or how was it?
Yeah, I guess for me, since I spent so much time studying Portuguese in Brazil, like 2 years before I even stepped foot in the country, because I couldn't. I would have gone to Brazil sooner if I could, but because of COVID, I couldn't. So I had a really good idea of like the history of the country, the politics, the pop culture. I was watching BBB. I was watching all these things. I listened to like because when I learn languages, I really immerse myself. So I was like, there was not a single English song on my Spotify Wrapped. It was all funk, sertanejo, pagode, things like that, bossa nova. And so basically when I got here, I was kind of like, it was kind of like a breath of fresh air because I was like, finally, I'm getting to experience all of this stuff that I like. I didn't hype it up, you know what I mean? I didn't like imagine that Brazil was something that it wasn't.
Right.
I think if anything, the biggest thing for me is over time living here, I've become more comfortable because Brazilians themselves tried to really scare me about living in Brazil. Like they tried to make it really seem like I was like, anytime I walked out of my door, someone's going to rob me. And it's like, okay, yes, there are areas which you need to take more precaution, but personally, I, as a gringo living in the country, I'm lucky and privileged enough that I don't have to live in those areas if I don't want to. And so far, like, I mean, Chicago, like there's plenty of places. I lived in San Francisco for years. Anytime I walked out of my apartment, I was getting assaulted. So like, like compared to San Diego,
for you, it was like,
it's more dangerous,
right? Same place. Well, and that's something that I tell people too, because they'll tell me, they'll be like, oh, don't you think it's dangerous here? And I'm like, well, I mean, so Chicago's dangerous. St. Louis is technically the most dangerous city in the whole country of the United States, per capita. And so
Right. I
like,
know that. Yeah.
and so like for me, and St. Louis was a normal place that I would go often. And so like, I always tell people where I used to go, I felt more scared than I do here. But the thing is something that I always tell people is like, you just kind of have to have common sense, like there's certain things that you just don't do. And then another thing is that it's all about where you are. Like you said, are there dangerous places to be? Sure, absolutely. But the thing is you have to avoid those. And I always tell people, like in the US, for example, I lived close to these cities, but I didn't live in these cities. I lived in
Right.
the countryside. I lived
Cover.
out on the
Sure.
farm basically. And so like for me, that was very safe. And for most
Yeah.
people, and most
You
people
leave your
in the
door.
US who don't live in these big cities, it's safe. It's okay.
Yeah.
And so I think, and it's the same thing here in Brazil, there's not a lot of crime
Exactly.
as soon as you get outside of the big cities. So I feel like that is something that some people kind of forget because you go to Sao Paulo and they're like, oh, it's crazy here. And you're like, well, if you go to Rio Grande da Serra, which is like at the end of the train line,
Right.
it's not really that dangerous because nobody
No.
unless you live there.
Something going on. There's like Paranapiacaba there, and like there's not too much.
Yeah.
And even like I live in Pinheiros, like Pinheiros, Vila Madalena. These more upper,
It's close to
more
the American
gentrified
consulate.
areas.
Yeah.
They're like, it feels, even at times it feels safer in here than Jundiaí, which is like one of the safest cities in the whole country. So it's like it's really depends on where you are, and like you said, common sense, because like I grew up in San Diego in the suburbs, so it was always really safe for me. It was no, my mom always tried to scare me saying, oh, someone's going to kidnap you and take you to Mexico. Like that was her constant thing, was like, because we lived like 30 minutes from the border, so
Right.
she's like, if you clear, you're gone. So she was always afraid of that, but that didn't actually really ever happen to anybody. And once I moved to San Francisco, I had a rude awakening that like I was so like fresh and green, you know what I mean? That because I went to college there, and when I was walking on the streets, I didn't have like situational awareness. For example, one time I was wearing headphones on the bus, and basically like I was just listening to music. All of a sudden, my eyes started burning, and I didn't know what was going on. And I looked up, and there was this guy fighting this lady, and he ran off the bus. Turns out he was trying to take pictures of her while she wasn't looking. She noticed, she started yelling at him, and he pulled out pepper spray and pepper sprayed her. And it was inside the bus, so we all got pepper sprayed.
Oh.
And since I had my headphones on, I had no idea. So ever since that day, right, like that was a lesson. I don't wear headphones. I'll read a book, but I need to be able to hear and see what's going on when I'm on public transit, because that was just one incident. I've had other incidents in San Francisco where I've gotten attacked. The metro here in Sao Paulo, never experienced anything like that. The worst is when the shopping train gets in your face and really tries to sell it to you. Okay, that's annoying, but who cares? He's just trying to make a little money, right? Like, I don't mind that.
Right. It's more annoying than it is like it's scaring you or you're feeling threatened.
Yeah.
Like that. No, I totally get that. And, kind of sticking on this culture thing. So that's cool. So you kind of got here, just were able to hug it and be like, this is wonderful. Because I always tell people, like, my experience was when I first came here, I had that typical gringo experience of like everybody loved me and thought I was interesting, and so it was paradise. It was fantastic. And what I always tell people, and I don't know if this is true for you, but I've talked to a couple other Americans who think similar. And basically, what happens is as soon as you can speak Portuguese well and you can have that deeper conversation, that's when you get treated like a normal person, and then they start to tell you about problems. They start to tell you about things. You start to have those more like political, the more, and then they start to kind of question you. And I always tell people that they kind of treat us like you are the representative of your country. And it's like, look,
not only your country, all of Gringolandia, like the whole
right,
like developed world, like
they're just like, yeah, you are. Let me tell you what's wrong with you and your people. And you're like, dude, I don't agree with what you're saying either. You know what I mean? Like, and I always tell people,
like, we do.
I was like, if there's one thing that and I always tell people this, and they kind of change their perspective. And I would say, there's one thing that like 96% of Americans all believe, whether they are left or right or whatever it may be. There's one thing that we all grew up believing and that we all hold dear to ourselves, and it is that we do not trust our government. Like,
Yeah,
and like I
literally.
was like, you can ask the American that's on the far left or the far right, they will both tell you the same thing. Yeah, I don't trust that because we know that they make problems. We know that they make mistakes and they have problems and they have all of these things. And so like when someone comes to you and tries to tell you like, look at what you did, and you're like, I didn't do it. And honestly, didn't know it was happening. And now that you've told me, maybe, I'll do what I can to fix it. But like, I'm not responsible for all of this. And I think sometimes we get
Yeah,
that.
I've got a question for you now because I was kind of making a video idea in my head, and so now I want to get your perspective on it. Uh, when you what was your first experience with the word vira lata?
When I heard it, it honestly, when it had to do with dogs, right? It had to do with mutts, right?
Okay.
That was the idea. But then after some time, I kind of learned what people wanted to say with it, because what happens is you have to understand, like, it's like the caramelo of the favela, right? The one dog that just is always there. And I learned what did they call it? The Vita Lata syndrome or something like that.
Síndrome de vira-lata, yeah.
I learned about that, and I I haven't experienced it personally, but I know people. I know specifically. I know Brazilians who go to the U.S. and they experience it because it's something that you experience a lot of times outside of your country. Like, what happens is, I know I had a lot of students who they go to the U.S. and they think that because the Brazilians that are there are Brazilians, that they're going to help them. They're going to kind of create a community. And a lot of times what they do is they end up, like, for example, they'll sell them a car, say that it's perfect, and then a couple of days later the car will break down or something like that.
I see.
And so that's kind of that's what
So
I
when you
end of it.
so when you hear can you describe it? Like, what is what is síndrome de vira-lata for you? Like, as you've lived in Brazil for this much time, like, and you've
It's
evolved.
it's basically when it's almost like the American version of entitlement. Like, you feel like you deserve something because you think that you're better, if that makes sense. It's kind of like how they talk about the Vita Latas, the dogs, right? How
Right, right.
it shows up to a place and it thinks that since it's there, it was there first, that is its area, and they're going to be the alpha dog. And so
Uh, okay. I
I think
see.
that when people feel that, they tend to feel like, for example, like it'd be like if I lived in São Paulo and you came to São Paulo, you didn't speak Portuguese, and you were like, "Oh, hey Sam, so like, what should I do here?" And I'll be like, "Oh, well, I mean, let me tell you what I did because I know this place, I know how it works, and I'll tell you to
Right.
do stuff." And then I'll be like, "No, no, no, here, let me sell you. I'll sell you this, or maybe I'll do your taxes or whatever it is, and I'll do it wrong. I'll just take advantage
Uh,
of the fact that
just
you don't know as much as I know, if that makes sense." That
that makes
I
yeah.
don't know. Does that kind of explain it a little bit more?
I think that might be maybe a different use of the word or a different thing, but the síndrome de vira-lata, it originally comes from in the 1950s. There was this match between Uruguay and Brazil, and basically Brazil lost, and it was so tragic to the national like psyche that people actually committed suicide in the stadiums. They committed suicide at home watching their
Wow.
TV, and it was this huge national shame, much like happened with the Setchiun, right, with Germany. So basically, this playwright called it the Síndrome de Vira-lata, saying that Brazilians voluntarily put themselves in a place of inferiority in relation to the rest of the world. So when Brazilians look at external cultures, they immediately feel inferior, not because the rest of the world is telling them that they are, but because they themselves are telling them, I'm inferior. And so this is like a national psyche, a national
That's
collect
that's it.
inferiority.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that, because that makes sense as to what somebody else explained it to me is that since they feel not. not saying that it's true or that it applies, but according to that logic, the person feels inferior to the culture, to the other people. And so by feeling that way, a lot of times we know when someone feels inferior, they want to make someone else feel even more inferior.
Yes, exactly.
So that's what happens. So since they feel that inferiorness, that's when it goes into the part that I explained, where it was like,
I think that's the next step. That's like a result of the vira-lata, right? So
like
someone who feels the syndrome de vira-lata is going to try and make themselves more identified with European or North American culture to say like, oh, you know, now that I've moved to the US, I don't do things this way, right? Like, oh, I throw my toilet paper in the bowl now instead of a trash can because I'm a cultured American, something like that.
Exactly.
Small example, right? Where they're
that's good.
off.
I appreciate that history. I'm glad. So yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, it's not a cool
because
thing.
I thought like, oh, you know, that's something that as a gringo, when I started reading like comment sections of like people where they started arguing politically, it's something that I see Brazilians call each other. Whether they're left or whether they're right, whether they're conservative or liberal, they will call each other vira-lata. And to me, I've always related it to like, you're an American, right? It's this idea of saying, you're ashamed to be Brazilian, right? And so by calling someone a vira-lata, you're saying, what? Are you ashamed to be Brazilian? That you have to say like, oh, I wish our country had more education like Europe, or I wish we had more economic success like the US. And so like a liberal will call a conservative that for defending like the US private healthcare system or something like that. They'll say, oh, you have syndrome de vira-lata. Whereas the conservative will call the liberal that for supporting things like gender neutral language or gay rights or something. And because all of these things are seen as foreign culture, so you can weaponize this sense of patriotism, whether you're on one side or the other.
Right. Do you think so since we've already entered into the grounds, do you think that affects this discussion that you probably have seen in comment sections, you've probably experienced already, of calling yourself an American? Like,
yeah, 100%.
Like, because I always talk to people, you know, because obviously as Americans, because I always tell people in English, there's not another way to say it. That's just how it is. That's how grammar works, right? And so
I've started to say U.S. American because it doesn't sound bad, and it doesn't hurt.
To some people, because like the rest of this is what I always tell people. I was like, if you look at like what's accepted globally, which I think is fair, American is the exception. And something that I tell people is like, because I'll get into an Uber, right, and we'll talk about things, and they'll ask me what I am, and I'll be like, oh, I'm an American. And they'll be like, well, we're all Americans, right? And I was like, to an extent, yes, but I'm not talking about continents. I'm talking about a country.
Nationality.
Yeah. I was like, I'm talking about my nationality, I am not I'm not saying that I'm not a continental North American, but,
right, yeah.
And I'm not saying that you're not South American. I'm just saying, you know, there's a name in my country, and that's just how we have been raised.
Yeah.
Now, I think what we're talking about, the syndrome de vira-lata, that I think that plays a part into, because like what I tell people is
why they care, right?
Yeah. Well, because that's something that I tell people. It was like, honestly, I think they're giving too much credit to Americans for thinking that they are better than the rest of them.
Yes.
I was like, honestly,
exactly.
Like if you go into the U.S. and be like, hey, do you call yourself American because you think you're better than Brazilians? I'll be like, yeah. What are you talking about?
They'll be like, what's a Brazil?
Right. And so it's
not
one
thinking,
of those,
like, not to be rude, but they're not thinking about you.
Yeah, they're not. And you know, it sounds, I always tell people, it's kind of like having like an ex-girlfriend that was really clingy, who's just like, they want you to retaliate and to return that, but
right.
They just don't care. And I tell people, I was like, now, do I think that should change? Do I think that Americans should maybe care a little bit more about the rest of the world? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. But quite frankly, you know, if I went to my dad and I told him about this whole thing about American, he's going to be like, why does that exist? Like, you know, what is even that, right? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so I can talk on this American thing for a moment. So my perspective is that it is a linguistic distinction, right?
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that this is how it is, but geography is not science. Geography is a cultural reflection of how we look at the world. So when I say, oh, there's 7 continents, that's because I was taught that there's 7 continents. In Brazil, there's 6 continents. That's a big difference. North and South America are not continents, they're subcontinents. America is one continent. So linguistically, for us, because there's 2, if I'm referring to the continent, I will say the Americas, plural, right? And you know, as an English speaker, you're like, oh, the Americas. I'm talking about the whole thing, right? Yeah. Whereas if I say North America, I'm talking about one thing. Or if I just say America, you think of the country. So singular America is a country, whereas plural is a continent. That's not the same in Portuguese, where singular America is a continent, and they actually do use the word American as a continental adjective, not super frequently, but it's there, right? Like Copa Americano is not called
linguistically.
It's because it's American.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because I think I talked to another teacher, and it was crazy because I thought that this was just like a Brazil thing. Turns out it's a South American thing, because she had lived in Argentina, and she had, it was, I like to call them just like American haters, you know, basically people who just hate on you because you're from a place, which is not right, you know. I don't think it's right for anywhere, for anything, but you know, they just hated on her. And she was like, look, she's like, in English, she's like, if I had another way to call myself to make you feel better in English, I would, you know, I would try to change. But the thing is, like we said, you know, linguistically, grammatically, this is the way it is. And it's one of those things where, do I understand what they're trying to say? Yes, I understand. But at the same time, you have to understand the other side of it. You know, it's not, if we're here in Brazil, if it makes you more comfortable, you want me to call myself estadunidense, that's fine in Portuguese. But even if you go into the translators and you put estadunidense, it translates to American. So like, there's no way around it. And you know, it's just, I think it's a lack of understanding on both. A
lot of these people who have this view think that, like you said, it's like an animosity sort of thing, where we're like, oh no, we're American, not you. Whereas, like, I think a lot of that mindset comes from like how they learn about history. They learn about the Monroe Doctrine, and they don't think about the fact that word came before the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like, it was because we had these 13 colonies that were literally like spoke different languages, had different currencies, didn't even like each other. So they needed to create. So at the time, right, legally, politically speaking, the only country that existed after the independence of the United States was America, the country. There was no such thing as another American country. There was France, there was Portugal, there was Spain, there was Britain. There was no Brazil at the time, right? So when they chose the name, they weren't excluding anyone. It's actually the contrary. They had the idea that the rest of the continent would eventually join them, right?
Yeah.
They would eventually like also become Americans, right? Rather than be British, or rather than be Portuguese, or these European mentalities. So it's pretty interesting. And I think the Síndrome de Vira-Lata does play into that, because when you talk about these people who are like these reactionary girlfriends, where they're like, I have a script and I want to execute it with you, you know, like, let's do this thing. Like, I want to feel better than you by telling you that I reject, right? So like, in a way, it shows a sense of inferiority, the fact that you actually even care about that. Because any normal, average Brazilian, you'll say, oh, de onde você é? You'll say, oh, eu sou estadunidense. And they'll say, americano, legal. Right? They will correct you and say Americano. And so like, when they do that to me, it's fine. I program myself to only say estadunidense because I don't care. Whatever. In Portuguese, I don't care. Right. When they say Americano, I just laugh to myself. I'm like, it's so funny that you can say that. Right. No one cares. You
can tell me, but I can't say it. Yeah. It's almost like go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we as Americans, we would never tell another people how how they should tell us that we should be called, right? Like if a Brazilian showed up and said, "Oh, I'm Paulista," we would call them whatever their
Paulista,
word is.
right?
No, we wouldn't say, well, that doesn't actually make sense because geographically, São Paulo is a state. How can you be from a city called São Paulo when the state is called São Paulo? It's like, that's the same thing that we have with New York. That's the same thing we have with America. America's
Right.
like you can be a Paulista and a
Well,
Paulista at the same.
and I think that's a difference where it's like, I think I always, and this is a thought that kind of came to me, is like, I think a lot of Americans are open to learning about it. We just don't have that culture yet of learning of other cultures. Cause like, I don't know about in California because I had like a couple uncles who lived there, but I've never really went out there. I still want to though, because California is a beautiful place. Everybody should go there and visit. But like out in the Midwest, at least, when somebody's different and somebody's from somewhere else, we ask them, we're like, where are you from? And they'll be like, oh, I'm, like you said, they'll be like, oh, I'm Paulista. And we'll be like, oh, this guy's Paulista or whatever, however Americans would try to say it. And they're very open to learning about it. Now, are they going to be a little ignorant? Maybe if they think you speak Spanish or something like that. Sure. But understand that they don't know, and they're learning. They're learning from you. And most of them, I would say most of them, once again, regardless of their, of their political leanings, a majority of the middle people who are normal, they will respect what you say about where you're from. And they will, if you say, if you tell them, you say, oh, I prefer that you call me a Brazilian instead of, I don't know, something else or whatever, instead of a Latino, they'll be like, oh, I'm sorry, and they'll
Exactly.
And
like me, for example, I'm Iranian, right? A lot of people will say Iranian. If I correct them and say, actually, it's pronounced Iranian, no one's going to be like, well, let's go look it up in the Oxford Dictionary, which I feel like is a really common reaction for Brazilians. They're like, well, let's go check the dictionary.
Right.
Right. And talking about that Spanish versus Portuguese thing, it's funny because here, when I get in an Uber, for example, and they say, seu nome é diferente, você é da onde? You'll say like, meu nome é de origem persa, right? And then they go, então você fala árabe. And so it's like this ignorance of geography, this ignorance of culture, it only goes one way in this country. Only Americans are able to be ignorant of other cultures. Brazilians not knowing about Farsi, for example, is not considered like a cardinal sin. And I think that says a lot to the Síndrome de Vira-Lata, because Brazilians are very aware of Europe and North America and what's going on in these places, Australia, New Zealand, but like Iran, for example, they're just as ignorant as we are about other places. So it's an interesting thing where like I feel like we as Americans, we just have this huge stereotype of being ignorant and stupid that, like you said about the Midwest, I definitely have this vision that it's more like that. In California, like half of my friends have immigrant families. We're constantly eating at each other's houses, learning each other's languages, eating each other's food, doing each other's traditions. So for me, I grew up in a huge, huge melting pot. So that's probably the only biggest thing, is the fact that for me, there's less culture here, like diverse culture.
Right.
There's like Brazilian culture itself, obviously, is enough to fulfill me, right? Like I'm spending all my time learning about Bahia, the South, all Amazonas, Tupi-Antigo. But Brazilian culture is plenty diverse that I don't need these external cultures. But that is a big difference, right? If you eat a foreign food, it's going to be very Brazilian. It's not going to be like, oh, I know this Chinese shop where the lady makes it just right, how we do in the US, where it's like, oh, I know this Japanese shop where the guy's from Japan. Right. It's like, here it's like, I know a Japanese shop where the family's like 10th generation Brazilian and
they're trying, right? They're trying to. It's funny because like sometimes I tell people, I was like, America does like Americanize. I say America, sorry, the United States does like tend to Americanize food a lot, but like at the same time, I always tell them, there's a lot of places that try to keep it as close to its roots as possible. Whereas like here in Brazil, most of the places try to make it like, for example, like cream cheese and sushi, right? Like that's not a thing, right? But here in Brazil, it is, and I like it.
Cream cheese on hot dog, cream cheese, catupiry goes everywhere.
Right. And so it's something that it's different, and that's a question that I have for you as well. So, do you think? So, kind of sticking on this side of Americans are ignorant, right? Like, do you think that like Americans are pretty accepting of of other cultures and immigration, for example, because a lot of people here, a lot of students that I have, or people who are getting ready to go to the States,
They have
they
fear.
have this idea, they have this thought that Americans hate immigrants, that they're just going to treat them terribly, and like Americans are just going to beat down and treat them as second class or third class citizens. Do you
Yeah.
believe that that is still like a strong, prominent cultural thing in the U.S., or do you think that that's kind of something that doesn't exist anymore?
I think that identity is always going to play a big part in it, right? So, like, if you are an African immigrant with dark skin and you speak very broken English, you're going to have a very different time than someone from Curitiba who's had English classes their entire life, and they're going to be an au pair and they're completely white skin and European, right? Like, you already know that's going to be a completely different experience between those two things. So it obviously, like any other country, it depends a lot on your background. In my opinion, if you look at the data, right, like US, in my opinion, gets a hugely bad and undeserved rap when it comes to immigration, because the biggest issue is that we have immigration. The number of Brazilians living in the United States currently, the total number of Brazilians, there are more people living there than the number of all immigrants from every single country living in Brazil, right? And so when we look at that statistic, we say, oh, there must be a lot of Brazilians there, right? Brazilians are one of the smallest groups of immigrants in the US. So that just gives you an idea. The US is by far the country that accepts the most immigrants in the world. After that would be Germany, which is like half of our number. So how can you look at the country who accepts more immigrants than anybody else in the world and say that that's a bad country for immigration? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not saying that there aren't problems, because there are. You're going to face prejudice. You're going to face all these things. But do you know why you're going to face these things? It's because you have the opportunity to immigrate and to become a part of those societies. If you look at a society like Portugal, for example, or Germany, not Germany, Germany is a little better, but like France and Italy, they're banning hijabs, right? They're getting really intense on these people. And these Europeans often like to look at Americans and say, oh, they're so racist. Look at all this bad news that's coming out. But the reason why we have news about racist incidents is because we have other ethnicities and races interacting with each other. Where there is diversity, there will be racism. That is just a given, right? So what does the US have more racism than most countries on an absolute level? Yes. But on a relative level, I think it's way smaller. It's just because we have so many immigrants that the raw number of racist incidents and xenophobic things, that's why we see so much more. But if, for example, tomorrow, like all of Argentina decided to rush the southern border, you think that the Brazilians down there aren't going to get a little racist or aren't going to get like, hey, this is our land, get out of here, you know?
Well,
Like,
they're doing that with Venezuela as well. If you
they
go,
do.
if you go up north and you see how people see Venezuela, that is one of those big things. Like I always tell people that what happens is you have some bad people that immigrate into a country from one place. And the issue is when you immigrate somewhere, you have to realize that whether you like it or not, you're going to represent your country for a lot of people. A lot of people are going to meet you, and you are going to be the first American contact that they're going to have in their life. And so you have to show them what our culture is, whether you want to or not. And so what happens is a lot of these people come in and they do terrible things to people, and they're like, oh, well, all of Venezuela is like that. And then it's not true, like you said. And I think it's interesting that you brought up, for example, because I do ask a lot of people about, actually a lot of people ask me about like racism in the US. And I tell people, I say there's racism, but it's not the same racism that you think of. I don't think it's the racism that people in their, I think a lot of people are racist by ignorance. Like you said, when there's diversity, it just happens. And I think what happens is when you have a group of people, for example, if you go to like Kansas out in the country where there's probably a group of this people who all look the same, and you show up into that place and you're different, they're going to treat you different. And it's until they understand you, until they finally understand that, if you're, if it's a white place and you're black, until they understand that, okay, just because he's black doesn't mean anything.
Right.
That's how we break down those barriers. And I think I like what you said, because like in the U.S., is there that racism? Yes, but does that racism get beaten every day? Like, do people fight against
Yeah.
it? Yes.
Yeah.
And I think
There's
that
more
is one
people
of,
fighting against it, for
yeah,
sure.
like for example, I always tell people, I was like, in the U.S. and when it comes to racism, there, it's every group against every group. Like for example, when I go into East St. Louis, that is like they're like 90% black, and so when I show up there, they don't like it. They don't like that I'm there. But when I start to talk to people, when I start to get to know people, they get more comfortable.
Yeah.
And
They
so
know you're
it's
okay,
just,
right?
yeah, and so it's just one of those things that, and I liked another thing you said, that was that in the United States there is immigrants, there is people, but there are people talking about it, and
Right.
they're the one of the big things I think, once again, when it comes to like politics, that most people support is that First Amendment right that we have, which is to be able to talk, and for news people to be able to publish these stories and for us to talk
Yeah.
about it, because
Because we're
I'm
not afraid
sure
to talk about it, right?
exactly. And like, if you talk to an American, they're probably going to sit down and have that conversation with you. Whereas
Right.
in other
Whereas if
places,
you talk to like a Portuguese, for example, and you say, "Oh, I saw there's some racism against Brazilians in Portugal," they'll be like, "What are you talking about? We don't have racism. That doesn't exist. You're one to talk. You're an American, right?" Like,
right,
like that's the big difference, is that we are willing to talk about racism. That's why you see us talking about
right. I think, and so I really, and I like that you brought up those statistics too, because I think that that's something people tend to forget. Like you said, does immigration
it. Yeah.
have problems? Like I told you before, like I'm going through it with my wife. It is annoying. It's bureaucratic.
Yeah.
And some of the questions that they ask are stupid. But I always tell people that the reason why the process is the way it is because something made it get there, right?
Yeah.
And they're trying to find a way to control or at least know what's happening, right? And when there's so many people who want to go there,
Yeah.
it's hard to do that. And so, is there problems? Yes, but at the same time, like you said, there's a lot of people who want to go there, and so
I have one question I want to ask you, because this is something that I guess it's like the flip idea. It's like our experience as immigrants here in Brazil. When you, at least for me, when I meet people, if they don't already know me, then we'll start talking, right? And I have a good enough Portuguese that we can start the conversation. But after like a few sentences, maybe it gets off of like normal conversation. They ask me a specific question. Then I got to say a word that maybe it shows my accent more, or I mess up the gender. In that moment, they notice that you're not Brazilian. Then the conversation changes to, você gosta do Brasil? Tipo, você é da onde? Tipo, quanto tempo aqui? And then it becomes the same exact conversation that you have with every single other person. Does this still happen to you, or have you gotten past it?
I not to toot my own horn, but I feel like I have a pretty good Portuguese accent. But it's in this case, my skin color and my eye color and my beard color, my hair color, all fights me, because I have that. When you look at the American man, like what Scott's video showed, like
Right.
I get into that. People categorize me, and so like for example, when they look at you, I think you can almost hide it a little bit better because you don't have that what they expect.
Right.
And so
Some people
like,
tell me I have cara de brasileiro.
right, and so like I have a friend, for example, who he's also like sour cream white, but he has black hair, and he doesn't have brown eyes, but he has like green eyes, and people will listen to him talk, and this guy has a thick accent, but they don't notice it because he doesn't look like it. And so
Interesting.
yeah, so for me, it's a lot of times they'll talk to me for a little bit, and then they'll be like, "This guy's not Brazilian, is he?" And I'll be like, "Nope." And then we go into that whole conversation about, well, what do you think about Trump? What do you think about that new president of yours? What do you think about this and this? And you're like, look, you almost have your answer like pre-recorded in your head, and you just press play on it, let it
refine it as you go, right? You come up, you're like, yeah, okay, let me turn on autoplay. Like, it breaks the connection. I don't know. To me personally, like, that is something that makes me feel really like an outsider, like I'm separate from the culture, right? Like Because sometimes like we'll be in a group of people, and when that happens, it's the worst. If it's one-on-one, okay, whatever. You want to have a little conversation about that, that's fine. But like we're all talking about one topic. I say something, someone in the group happens to not know me, and they go, say gringo. And then boom, the whole conversation is focused on me. I got the spotlight when I just wanted to be a part of the conversation. I don't want all that attention all the time, right? So that's probably the only alienating thing that I feel about being an immigrant in Brazil. And it's not a negative thing, right? Like nobody's being racist, nobody's being xenophobic. It's just like you said, in ignorance, where like in the US, we do that. At least I'm sure it's more common where you're from, where you're saying you're out in the country, but like in California, we have a little bit more consciousness to not immediately other people, you know what I mean? Not immediately ask questions that make people feel like they're not, you know, like we got to stop the conversation for them because their Portuguese wasn't good enough, right? Or something like that.
Right. No, I agree with that. And I think like for me, when it comes to like being an immigrant here, it's the idea of like what happens is they have their idea of what an American is. And because I even look like it, they just assume that I fix it. For example, one of the things that they always assume of Americans here is that we make dollars and we're living in Brazil. We're just living it up because it's great. Right. And, you know, I don't make dollars. I always tell people, I was like, I live in your reality. Like, you know,
you're Brazilian.
Yeah. I live in Brazil. I have a CNPJ. I have all of these things. And I tell people, I was like, I know I don't know everything, but when you talk about the suffering that you go through, the inflation, all these things, like I get it. I understand because I participate in it. And so sometimes they think that I don't know, you know, and it's kind of like when you look at it's kind of like how in the US, I always tell people that sometimes people just go up to someone and just because they hate that group at the moment, they'll be like, you don't know what we're going through. And it's like, you know, I've been through a lot of things. Like you know, for example, have you heard of the Mormons before? The guys that come. So that's how I came to Brazil. That's how I got through it. I was a missionary in São Paulo. And I was like, a lot of people don't know it, but like I would walk on the street and people would just call me the devil. They would tell me how terrible I am and I'm taking people to hell and like just all of these super like mean things. And then, like I said, on top of that, they come at you with the whole America is these greedy capitalist pigs that are going to destroy the world. And it's like, you know, like, what did I do? Right. You know? And so I think sometimes, like you said, it can be a good spotlight and sometimes it can be a bad spotlight. And it's just, once again, it goes back to ignorance, you know, not knowing, meet somebody before you decide to tell them how much you like them or you don't like them or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
What's your
100%?
What's your thoughts?
I would agree with that totally. I mean, that, you know, being a missionary is definitely putting a target on your own back, right? Like for me personally, you know, you got to know the person, right? Because you're obviously a really cool guy and everything. But you know, if the only thing I knew about you was that you were a Mormon missionary, of course, the first thing that go to my head are like, okay, U.S. imperialism, you know, trying to erase native cultures, things like that. That's what I personally think. Right. It's like, let me replace your culture with my culture because my culture is better. And if not, you're going to hell. Right. And it's like, that's my prerogative. So to me, like, obviously, I'm personally against that kind of evangelism. I think that it's viral and stuff, but I'm still able to be friends with Scott. I know that he was a missionary. I'm still able to have a conversation with you because to me personally, these are systems, right? Like you were born into this system. You were born into that life. You were born into all of this. And so if I just come up to you and try and like shit on you because you were a victim of the system or whether you like it or not, you're a part of the system, that's not a personal thing, right? Like my personal gripe with that system has nothing to do with you as an individual. And if I just come up to you with that animosity, then that's just, that's just rude. And that's not how people should exist. That's the big problem with society today is that people have these identities where if you really care about that person and you think that like if I wanted to explain my thoughts about you, about these things, of why I think these things, the first thing I could come up to you is say, oh, you capitalist, imperialist pig trying to shove your religion down everyone's throat. Like, you're not going to be very receptive to the things I'm going to say after that, right?
Right. You say that
That's not how we open hearts, right? Like,
No, and
if I come up and say, hey, man, like, have you ever thought about these implications of what you're doing here? And then maybe you haven't, maybe you have, and maybe you have, and you have a perspective that I haven't thought about, right?
Yeah. And
because especially with things like religion, we have to be very sensitive about these things. Religion, to me, is not the same as politics. It's something very sensitive.
I agree with you. I think that religion, I don't know if you can separate religion and politics, but I do think that they're different. I think that, like for some, a lot of people, it's kind of like when we were talking about like Venezuela with Brazil, where like a couple bad people come and do things, and so everyone thinks that they're all like that. Like I always tell people, like for example, I was a missionary, and like you said, a lot of people think of like some guy who's going to like just come up to you and just keep hounding away trying to get you to convert and to buy into their thing. But my thing was, and this is what I always told people, I was like, look, I'm going to ask you if you want to hear me. If you don't want to hear me, then I'm not gonna push it. You know what I mean? Because that's kind of how I was, and I knew that, like obviously we're from a different place, we bring a different style of things, and so I don't expect anybody to buy into these things. The issue is like you said, a lot of people just don't know, and so they come up to you with all of these preconceived notions that you are this. And, it's just like how after like 9/11 in the US, all of a sudden the country got even more like anti-Muslim. And the thing is they didn't understand the Muslim religion. They didn't look into it. They didn't understand that those were, whoever did that, that doesn't represent everybody and how,
of course.
Yeah. And I think that's how you have to look at most things is like, look, like you said, you talk about Scott, there's Isaac, there's so many people who they come and they do that, and they're not bad people, and they're not usually what you think they would be if you had known that about them from the beginning, And so I think that can happen too a lot, especially in the whole mixture of things. But yeah, well, we're getting close to the end. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm having a lot of fun, actually. I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
Talked about, and like I always say, there's always so much more we could probably keep going on and discussing, but we'll save that for part 2 in the future if you're ever willing to come back.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure we'll have more topics to talk about, and I'm curious to see what your students comment about, what they're curious about, what they know.
Well, and that's the big thing.
Yeah, I'll try to be in the comment section, responding to people as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So everybody who's listening, I'll have Kian's information everywhere. I'll have everything, so you guys can go follow him and then see what's going on. And also leave your comments, ask your questions. If you guys heard something that we said and you just really want to let us know what you think about it, then comment it here on the video, or find us on Instagram and tell us there, and maybe in the future we'll come back together and respond to a couple of those things, see what you all think, and it'll be fun. But Kian, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Do you have anything that you want to say before we finish the recording?
No, I just want to say thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation, and it's nice to share these perspectives because, like I said, there's not that many immigrants in Brazil. So when we get to talk about these things, it gives me a sense of community, like there's someone that understands. Speaking of, I might want to ask you for some tax help if you've already gone through that.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah. I'll help you out. But cool. All right. Well, everybody have a good night, or a good day whenever you're listening to it. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time on Bled Talk. Thank you for listening to Bled Talk. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more content. We are on all of the popular podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and we're even on YouTube. Don't forget to send in your questions and your suggestions. Thank you once again, and have a great day.